Have you ever had a dirty cry? I'm not talking about the single solitary tear that rolls down your face, as dramatic as it might be. I mean a time of anguish, when you just let the floodgates loose, tears pouring from your eyes in despair. That is the type of emotion described in the book of Lamentations. The setting is the same as the book of Jeremiah. About 600 years before Jesus was born, when King Nebuchadnezzar's army invaded the city of Jerusalem, they destroyed this city, even the temple, the space of holiness. They captured the leaders and the young men and women, dragging them to Babylon. So it's called the time of exile. The book of Lamentations, tradition says, was written by Jeremiah, the same person who wrote the book of Jeremiah. And this is about his reaction to this terrible time. He describes how awful it is to be left behind in Jerusalem, that the people there are groaning with their grief. The priests who used to work in the temple are now starving to death. Infants and elderly are also starving. And Jeremiah himself is weak. People, his own people, are taunting him and making fun of him. He says multiple times in this book, "My stomach is churning." He even says, "I spread my vomit on the ground." You can show this next picture. I tried to make the word vomit less disgusting by making it cursive. But that's how upset he was. I don't think he had a virus. I think this was a stress reaction. Have you had one of those? Where you are so upset, your body reacts to the stress. And in the scripture passage we read today, he says, "My affliction and my homelessness is like wormwood and gall." I had no idea what that meant. So I had to do some research, which you can all do too. Just Google wormwood and gall. This beautiful plant is wormwood, but it's bitter. You would not want to eat this. And gall is actually the bile within our bodies. So he's saying, my situation right now is so bitter and disgusting. And yet, Jeremiah has hope. Because suddenly he recalls that God's love is everlasting. And God's mercy is fresh every morning. Great is God's faithfulness. Can you imagine his situation? Our second scripture reading today came from the book of Daniel. This is Daniel in the lion's den. This is his story in the Bible. But there's more to his story. Daniel was one of the people during the exile, one of the young men who was kidnapped, captured, and taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. Once he was there, he was chosen as one of the flawless ones who should work in the palace. And he was supposed to be trained for 3 years to serve. They gave these captives, the future servants, a royal spread of food to fatten them up. However, as a Jew, Daniel couldn't eat all the food they were serving. He believed they would make his body unclean. And so he and a few friends refused to eat the food they were given. One of the guards noticed and said, "You have to eat. It's my responsibility. You have to eat so that you can serve the king." And Daniel said, "Creatively, give us 10 days. If me and my 3 friends only eat vegetables and water, drink water for 10 days, compare how we look to all the others, and if we're not sick like you expect us to be, then we'll continue eating this diet. The guard was willing to do that, and sure enough, after 10 days, those 4 young men looked better than the rest. I don't know how, but that was the first Daniel fast. You might have heard of a Daniel fast. That's what they're referring to. He continued to stand up with faith against the culture that he was in captive to. He was a captive of. That's why he ended up in the lion's den. He refused to stop praying to God. And so they tried to kill him, and it didn't work miraculously. But I think another miracle of this story is that in spite of his situation, being a captive in a foreign land, trying so hard to live his faith, in spite of his oppressors, Daniel had the ability to envision the future, the goodness of what lay ahead for God's people, for the ones who strive to live righteously. And he said, someday, after a lot of anguish, we will be delivered. Someday, we will shine like stars. I think those are 2 miracle stories in the Bible. One, that Jeremiah, in spite of all the suffering around him and to him, he was able to say, God's love and mercy is everlasting. And Daniel, who was on the other side of the exile in a foreign land, was able to say, in spite of all the things going on around me and the things I am suffering, I envision a time of deliverance and goodness for us as God's people. These miracles are still happening. They're not just recorded in the Bible. Some of them are recorded in your hymnals. Amazing Grace was written by John Newton. In the 1700s, he was a man who had so many near-death experiences. Have you all heard of survivor's guilt? Imagine his survivor's guilt. At one point, he was thrown off a horse and barely missed being staked by metal, I guess a metal fence, impaled by a metal stake. Maybe no survivor's guilt there, but I suspect he had it when the day he was running late to tour a warship. The ship took off without him. His colleagues were on board, and he watched from the shoreline as it capsized and they all died. This is a man who survived malaria. That was before you could take pills when you were traveling. This was also a man who went on a hunting trip to Africa. And while he was there, he got lost in a swamp and thought he was going to die, but managed to survive. I think I have more. I mean, it's unbelievable how many things this man survived. There was a storm at sea. This is one more survivor guilt stories. He was working on a boat, and someone replaced him. He went beneath the deck, and a wave came and took the person who had replaced him overboard. He also had a stroke, which many of you can understand. He described these situations as dangers, toils, and snares. And yet, as he wrote in his song, he said, I have already come this far, and grace has brought me safe. Grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. Do you hear him echoing the scripture passage we just heard? So in spite of all the suffering that he had experienced and survived, the survivor's guilt he surely had, he was able to recognize God's goodness. The man who wrote, "Precious Lord, take my hand," didn't have so many near-death experiences, but he experienced something maybe some of you might relate to or understand. He was at work, away, traveling, the day that his wife died in childbirth, and then his infant son died the next day. He was so upset and experiencing such despair. He was having nervous breakdowns and contemplating suicide. And yet something, I would suggest the Spirit, God's Spirit, compelled him to go to a piano. And that's where he started writing this song. "Precious Lord, take my hand. Lead me on and let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm and through the night, lead me on to the light. Guide my feet and hold my hand." That was Thomas Dorsey in the 1930s. Many of us experience these types of suffering. And I don't know what personally churns your stomach, makes your body react in a way of despair and grief, maybe even makes you want to throw up. It's so upsetting. Sometimes I pass around a microphone and invite you to share. I'm not going to do that today. But I would like you to consider, how do you experience God in these moments that are so difficult to bear? Can you find hope like Jeremiah in God's everlasting love and new mercies every day? Can you envision with hope the future of goodness that lies before us beyond our experience here on earth, like Daniel did? However you see God working, I'd like to encourage you to write it down sometime this week. It can help you process it. If you're not going to discuss this over lunch, vomit and lunch, not a good idea. But write it down. That's what Jeremiah did for Lamentations. That's what Daniel did in his book. And their records of their faithful experiences have been passed down generation after generation after generation, thousands of years. Your faith experiences are just as important as theirs. So I encourage you to write it down. Even if you don't want to share it right now, tuck it away. And maybe someone will find it someday and be encouraged in their own faith. I am most certain today that God still does miracles for us. Even today, as we approach 2020. So we've got a video right now to watch as you think about your own personal experiences that you'll either share later. If you prefer to talk than write, you could do that. Or if you prefer to write, you could write it down later. But God still does miracles today.